If you talk to most volunteers, they would say, I want you to set expectations. I want you to explain to me exactly what you want me to do. Because a lot of people look at volunteering and go, oh, well, you can just do whatever you want. You're volunteering. At the end of the day, you're volunteering for a reason. And if the organization is giving you the right purpose as a volunteer, then you can deliver whatever the experience is, whatever the role is that you've been given.
That was Matt Lynch, founder of MoonShot. Have you ever wondered why some live experiences capture our hearts better than others? Consider places like Disneyland, where a commitment to exceptional service excellence sees them described as the happiest place on earth. MoonShot works with organisations to engage and train frontline staff and volunteers to live and breathe brand ethos through programs that provide opportunities for upskilling and connections. While you might hear Disney and think, well, all well and good if you have a big budget, but how does this apply to someone like me? In this episode of the podcast, Matt discusses how organisations of all shapes and sizes and budgets can implement simple steps to better engage with their staff and volunteers to ensure a world-class experience for volunteers, fans and participants alike. As the world pivots away from in-person training to the digital world, we also discuss the importance of understanding volunteer motivations to accommodate engaging experiences for a diverse range of backgrounds and demographics. Now, if this is the first time listening to the podcast, then welcome. The Engage Volunteer podcast aims to highlight the ways in which organisations and individuals are engaging with their communities to connect them to events and causes they're passionate about. The best way to support us is to click follow wherever you listen to your podcasts and make sure you never miss an episode. We'd also love to get your feedback on the podcast and any suggestions you may have of any guests you'd like to hear from. Please do feel free to get in touch and contact us via our website or LinkedIn. Please feel free to tell your friends and colleagues about us too. Enjoy. Matt Lynch, welcome to the Engage Volunteer podcast, mate. So good to have you. Where do we find you today, mate? You're in the sun, is it?
Shannon, I'm in Spain. I'm about an hour and a half north of Barcelona in this little small village where no one speaks English and everyone speaks Catalan, but they're lovely people and
Right.
they bring us vegetables every morning. So it's a nice place to be.
Okay. Where's home for you, Matt?
Yeah, so we're based in the UK. I live in North London. Lovely place, very near Arsenal Football Club, which is my team, but we're not doing so well after game one. But yeah, North London is our headquarters.
Lovely, mate. Lovely. Well, for our listeners, MoonShot's an incredible organization. We work with you guys on many major events around the world. Love you to give us a bit of a picture of what the organization is and your role clearly there.
Yeah, I'm proud to lead the MoonShot team. We are really lucky in the events and organizations we get to work with around the world. We train and engage frontline staff in a majority of those scenarios. It's volunteers who we love working with because they're so passionate and they're purpose-driven people. So we focus on that. It's all about engagement programs with those volunteers or frontline staff. It's the training, giving them some real direction, focus, and I think most volunteers really appreciate that they're really have a clear path about what is expected of them and some advice and little things that can help them engage more with the visitor, the fan, the guest, or whoever they're working with. So yeah, MoonShot, really, that's what we're all about. It's just about that training and engagement with frontline staff.
Yeah. Awesome, mate. And you obviously started the company and by yourself too, Han Solo. Give us a bit of a picture of maybe why you started it and when you started it.
Yeah, I'm going to be a little bit honest here, Shannon. I believe in honesty. I mean, I moved over to the UK to be head of guest services at Wembley Stadium back in 2014. And I was with Wembley, what I believe the most iconic stadium in the world, for 2 years. It just the strategy and the focus on the front line just wasn't there yet. So I felt like I had to find a new purpose for myself, and didn't want to move back to the U.S. because of my kids and they were in schools and all that. And my role, my position, you find it in every stadium in the U.S., but in the U.K. it was a new role, and I didn't see one happening anytime soon in the UK that would fit what I wanted to do. So I decided, you know what, I'm going to kind of go out on my own. I never really thought I would do that, but it was something that felt like it was the time to do it. So yeah, after leaving Wembley, I kind of started MoonShot. and knew that there was an opportunity in the UK to focus on frontline staff and what they can bring to the guest experience or the fan experience. There's a lot of opportunity, I think, and that's what I'm passionate about. So that's kind of what brought on Moonshot. It wasn't any kind of, I've always kind of worked within organizations and worked with teams and leadership to focus on the things that bring a great guest experience or a visitor experience. So yeah, that's kind of what it was. It was after I left Wembley and headed in that direction.
So you're clearly from the States, and so you had experienced this, and a lot of professional teams and stadiums over there probably have this a little more dialed than perhaps the rest of the world. So you'd experienced that, came to the UK, seen that there was an opportunity there, and thought, why not try and own that space a little and create your own company from that?
Yeah, I mean that's exactly what it was. I moved to the UK from the US, where I'd worked, for the College Football Hall of Fame, which is a visitor attraction in downtown Atlanta, and also for the Atlanta Braves baseball team, where I was there for 6 years. Really saw some powerful, impactful frontline staff doing, special things, create emotional connections for people. And then, came over to the UK and just really saw that there was an opportunity for this to kind of, change create that change within the environment where it's more focused on how do you deliver a great experience for people instead of maybe security focused, or you have to do both. But I think sometimes it's 100% this and 0% that. And so I think that's really kind of what drove me to say, what, let's try to get in here and kind of change the dynamic of how venues are run.
Yeah. Why is it different, do you think? Americans clearly they go bigger and bolder in a lot of facets. Like, what's the difference?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. I just think it's the UK is just a little bit behind the US when it comes to customer focus or guest focus, right? And I also there was this thing even when I was at Wembley that people felt like, oh, well, we don't have the people that can deliver that experience, right? So, Americans and they are all about customer service, and so they can deliver, but I just don't believe that. I think there's people everywhere around the world. You just have to find them. So it's about selection of staff. And I think that's
Hmm.
hard work. That's really hard work to find the people instead of just letting anybody represent you in your venue. So it's about selection, and it's about strategy, and it's also about empowerment and all these other things. But I just think that, especially in the UK, I think it's time. I think you spend a lot of money on tickets to events. I do it myself going to Arsenal,
Hmm. Hmm.
and you want that experience. You want that connection. You want to be able to see the same staff every time you go there. You want them to know who you are. You want them to connect with your kids. It's all these things, and I think it's turning a corner for sure.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I notice it too, especially in the events that you and I have worked in. Now, we first met at the Super Bowl working, was it Houston, Matt? Was that the first one or was it a later one?
Atlanta was our first Super Bowl.
Atlanta one. And you guys have done every Super Bowl since, which is great. And Atlanta was a really special program for both of us. Moonshot, you guys work with the NFL and the Super Bowl. Do you want to give us a picture of like what you guys do as an organization for them? Like, how do you work with them to provide this assistance? Are you part of their team? Are you consultants? How does it work?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we're really proud of our relationship with the NFL. They treat us like, like we're not just a partner, but really a vital part of their operation. And we support the Fans First program, which is the guest services and teammate recognition program of the National Football League at all of their marquee events. So we have kickoff coming up, which is, in September, early September, the first game of the NFL season. We support them on Pro Bowl, the Super Bowl. If you don't know what Pro Bowl is, kind of like the All-Star game where all the best players get to go this year or next year to be in Las Vegas. So we really, we deliver their guest services program, which if you think about it, the National Football League is a league, right? But they hold all these massive events. So they want to make sure that at those events, they're providing a consistent experience for their fans, their guests, their VIPs, anybody that is attending that event. So for instance, last year in Tampa or the year before in Miami, so we train every single staff member on the ground. It could be stadium staff, it could be volunteers, and volunteers, in the last three Super Bowls and even before that, make up a massive amount of the workforce of the frontline staff that are out there connecting with all of these fans and guests. So it's an important aspect to make sure, again, that the volunteers know exactly what their role is and exactly how they can exceed expectations in every time they engage with somebody. So yeah, we work closely with the NFL all year round at all of their events. And volunteers, again, I mean, Atlanta, there was 50,000 volunteers. So usually we either support a train the trainer program where we train their trainers to deliver the fans first program, or we train every single volunteer ourselves, like we did last year in Tampa, delivering over 45 live webinar training sessions. So yeah, we're really we love going to Super Bowl. It's interesting that I had to move to England to then go back to the US to attend my first Super Bowl. But as you know, it's like nothing else. The show that the NFL puts on, it's amazing, it's electric, and you want to be a part of it.
Yeah, I remember early days, there's a lot of sort of a Disney influence around the way staff were trained at Disney and the smiley, happy faces you see there and the way that the staff engage with you at Disneyland. Is there a connection there with Moonshot and that sort of past world for you, Matt?
Yeah, I mean, there absolutely is. I mean, when I was in university, there was kind of an internship program at Disney. It's called the college program. And I was on that program for 2 semesters while I was in university. It absolutely changed my direction in my career. Once I did that.
Why is that? What was it about it that you loved that you needed to change course from that internship?
You know what? I'm just being honest, Shannon. It opened my eyes to kind of how an experience should be and how you should empower and select your staff. I felt when I was there, I was 19. I felt like, you know what? I've been given the tools to do the job. I have a responsibility, right? So they really kind of give you that you're here, to deliver this experience for these families that spend a year's worth of savings to come to this special place, and we expect you to take care of them. We don't want anybody leaving here that's unhappy. And I mean, I have a million examples of times where myself or another fellow cast member said, you know what, we have to take control of the situation because this kid just threw up on himself, and he's going to remember that for the rest of his life, that he had to leave Disney World because of that situation. How do we manage that situation so then that family doesn't leave right now and have to go back to their hotel and then maybe never come back here? So it absolutely changed the course of my career. And even after university, 2 weeks later after I graduated, I moved to London. So that was the first time I lived in London, when I was 22. And The Lion King, the musical, was coming to the West End. And so I was lucky enough to get a position there, frontline staff member working on the doors of the Lyceum Theater, tearing tickets and welcoming guests to The Lion King when it opened in London in 1999. So then my Disney, and I know the leaders there, I'm still connected with them. And they said the reason why we picked you is because you had worked for Disney, right? And Disney were coming into the theater to put on this the musical. So Disney is really an important part of my career, and it really changed the direction that I headed in.
Yeah, it's such an important part, isn't it, about that empowering, and it's a very interesting concept for volunteering about the expectation. How you said there, like we expect you to deliver X. Can you talk to us a bit about that, setting expectations for volunteers and perhaps not overstepping the mark of, we'll get to it about paid staff versus volunteers, but about setting expectation for volunteers so they know what they need to deliver and they know that they've got an important job to play compared to just, oh, thanks for being here, that's enough, like have fun today, that sort of thing. Like there's a balance there, isn't there?
Definitely. I mean, I think this is an important point about volunteering. And I think if you talk to most volunteers, they would say, I want you to set expectations. I want you to explain to me exactly what you want me to do. Because a lot of people look at volunteering and go, oh, well, you can just do whatever you want. You're volunteering. At the end of the day, you're volunteering for a reason. And if the organization is giving you the right purpose as a volunteer, then you can deliver whatever the experience is, whatever the role is that you've been given. And as we know, volunteering isn't just about wayfinding. Volunteers work in accreditation, volunteers work in support functions, volunteers work at the airports and on all these. There's so many different roles. And I think it's important that volunteers know exactly what is expected of them because they want to know. They want to have that purpose. They want to do a great job. They want to, at the end of the day, they want to walk away and say, I really made a difference today. So, I think, again, just because someone's volunteering doesn't mean that they're just coming to hang out. And I think volunteers know that. And I think as an organization, you have to set them up for success, which means you have to provide excellent training. You have to give them a purpose of what they're supposed to be doing. So it's not just role specific training, but it's also a bigger picture training of kind of what we're trying to deliver at X Super Bowl or at this Cricket World Cup or at the Euros. So I think, again, if you talk to most volunteers, they'd much rather have very focused direction than just let them go off and do whatever, and I think you see it a lot when volunteers maybe drop out or they don't show up for a shift. And usually, in a lot of instances, it's because they didn't feel like their role was valued and they had a purpose, a purpose of being there.
Yeah, if I'm not there, it doesn't matter much. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So you have to do that, or you start to, retention, you start to lose volunteers, and then you can't deliver what you're trying to deliver, right?
Yeah, really interesting. We had Andy Newman on a recent podcast, head of the Com Games Volunteer and Workforce Program. He really summarized the difference between paid staff and volunteers in a really succinct, nice way. And I think the summary is the vibe that volunteers bring is different to that of paid staff. You've worked with both. What's your experience with that? And perhaps maybe how do you engage with paid staff versus volunteers?
In our instance, and what we're trying to do, we're trying to give everyone the same kind of common purpose and direction of how to deliver whatever it is, right? But I'd agree with Andy that when you're engaging and interacting with volunteers, right, they're in it for different reasons, right? You often hear people say, "Well, what's in it? What's in it for me?" Right? So how do you, for a volunteer, what's in it for them is very different from somebody who's there in a paid role. So as a volunteer, what's in it for me? I want to create new social connections, right? And I saw this at the Euros. I mean, it's pretty unbelievable the relationships people build with each other working as volunteers. Even after the fact, they're going out, and having social gatherings with each other, and they just met each other and volunteered at an event. So they want to have these social connections. They want to have some purpose in their life. So they're looking for a bit more purpose in whatever they're doing. So that's why they volunteer. So there's a lot of different reasons, right? And different things that they're looking for that a paid staff member potentially is not looking for. And I think you have to be very focused on delivering that. And of course, throughout the pandemic in the last year and a half, a lot of those things have been challenging to deliver to the volunteer, right? So for instance, in-person training, volunteers love coming together and connecting with each other. And usually that happens when you do in-person training, when you're bringing them together to get ready for an event. And we haven't been able to do that. So we've had to deliver training in a virtual environment. So again, for the volunteer, they're going, "Oh yeah, I'm not getting what I'd like out of this to a certain extent because I want to have that social interaction. I want to connect with new people." And so, it's definitely been a challenging environment the last kind of year and a half because you're not ticking the box for that volunteer. What's in it for them? Like you used to be able to do because they want those things that now, at least during this period, during the pandemic, you haven't been able to give them. So, I know for a fact, even working through the Euros, both for the City of London, we helped deliver their training program, and for Wembley Stadium, that, everyone was very focused on how do we make up for those things, right? How do we make up for that we're not being able to bring this group together in large group settings and see those connections being made. So I think it's definitely top of mind, and people are aware, in the volunteering community, that this is an important part of being a volunteer and what's in it for them, what they're trying to get out of the experience.
Yeah. So for those listening, what are some ways that you've been able to engage with your volunteers in a virtual sense? Is there any advice for people out there, the best ways to do it? I know it's difficult.
Yeah, I mean, listen, this has been a learning experience for everyone. I mean, the number of, again, live webinar training Moonshot has done in the last year and a half, it's off the charts. I mean, again, like we said at Super Bowl, over 45 live webinar sessions. Everyone's learning. How do you connect with people where in most instances, it's a one-way communication, right? It's somebody, speaker or presenter or facilitator communicating one way to a screen. We don't like that either. I'd much rather be in a massive auditorium with all these people where you can see faces, you can read body language. But I think in that environment, we've tried to engage with live quizzes where they can do it on their phone so they still feel connected. With the City of London, we were doing things where we were doing live polls. So we would ask a question and then they could see kind of what the response was popping up on the screen to kind of engage conversations. I think these things are really important. The other thing that we learned, is the chat room. The chat room can just be off the chain because again, the volunteer is trying to connect with other people. That's one of their main drivers. So making sure that you're managing the chat room so then there can be that social contact. I mean, it's a stream of kind of like, hey guys, what's going on? Hey, this is who I am. This is where I'm working. And you could see that the volunteer is basically doing the same thing that they would do in person. If 10 minutes before a session was started, now they're doing it in the chat room because they still want to have that social connection. So it's been a learning experience for everyone. There's no doubt about it. I mean, we're all learning through this, and again, trying to provide the best experience for the volunteer as we possibly can.
Yeah. Now, just before you said there's a different reason why paid staff and volunteers are there. If you don't mind getting a little granular with me about perhaps different demographics of volunteers and why they're there as well. Is there, and this for the benefit of our listeners, wanting to perhaps engage more with younger people. From your experience dealing with younger volunteers, is there a reason why they're there and and a way to treat and engage them compared to perhaps older demographics that may be the more common audience of volunteers? There's often a clear difference in the two audiences and the way we engage them. What's your experience been, and what advice have you got there?
Well, I mean, working in this, environment, I know that most organizations that are looking for volunteers now want to have that younger demographic, and it's been something that's missing, right? And so it's my belief that going after that younger volunteer is very much about purpose, right? So making sure that you're providing a clear purpose for that younger volunteer. And by the way, that's the same reason why that older volunteer is also volunteering. But you have to really focus on what is that younger volunteer and where they are in their life and their, and at their age, what is driving them? What is their purpose right now? And how do we kind of find and connect with that younger volunteer? And at the Euros, I felt like, what, you really saw it. But I also, the younger volunteer, but I also know that it was a strategic initiative as part of that organizing team to make sure that they were going after younger volunteers, that they were selecting younger volunteers to bring that demographic into the volunteering community. So, I think, again, what's in it for them? And I think you have to look at all of your demographics from your young to your old to your diversity groups and say, what's in it for this group? And you have to be strategic about it then. You have to say, okay, well, we know this is what's in it for them, even if you have to do focus groups with those demos and say, why would you volunteer? And then making sure that you're focused on those, on those reasons on how to go after that group.
Yeah. And then it's, I guess for a Super Bowl, from yours and our experience, that's a 12-month volunteer program, effectively from start to finish. It's a long time to keep people engaged. Again, perhaps a more granular question, but wanting to focus on why people signed up in the first place and making sure you're covering those bases throughout that 12 months. How do you find the balance, especially dealing with thousands of volunteers, between making sure that young person's getting what they want out of the program versus perhaps a different demographic that wanted something else? Do you sort of personalize experiences a little? Are you making sure they're in different roles and responsibilities from the start? Like, how do you segment the journey when you have such a large audience of people you need to be communicating with?
I think this is one of the biggest challenges, especially with a Super Bowl organizing committee, is to engage over that massive amount of time, right? And it comes down to, a lot of communication, a lot of things that Rosterfy, the system, does, you guys, do to ensure that that communication is there. But I think it's also about setting up and knowing what your volunteer wants, which is how do you create social interactions during the periods of time when they're not volunteering, right? And that's for different demographics, right? So, what do young people want? What does this diversity group want? What does this older group want? And constantly creating opportunities for them. It's almost like being a camp counselor, where you're looking at all these people that are in your cabin or whatever, and you're going, okay, how do I keep everybody engaged here? And I think you have to look at, especially over a long period of time, you have to set out an engagement calendar to a certain extent that's separate from just the time that from their volunteer. Like, separate out the volunteering when they're actually volunteering, but what are you doing that other time? Like, how are you keeping them connected? And that's a really, really big job that I'm sure that a lot of volunteering coordinators don't really, see at the very beginning that that's their job, but it is, right? It is, because you want to keep them connected and engaged. So you have to be thinking about, and again, it's a lot about the social aspect. It's about connecting them and having them build relationships with other volunteers that they potentially might work with. Again, if you think about like high performing teams, right? High performing teams are people that connect with each other. They understand how everyone in their group works. So if you have a big team that's going to be working on accreditation and they're all volunteers, and in 3 months' time, these guys are going to be working every day for 10 days in a row together. Well, you're going to think about, how do we build teamwork within that team? We need to do it now, right? And we need to do it with social interactions. We need to have them connecting with each other right now. So then when they get into that world of accreditation or, whatever it is, they already know each other. They know how each other works. Everybody's different, so they understand each other's kind of mannerisms and all that sort of stuff. So I think, it's a big job is the answer.
For sure, 100%. And you've given me an idea. I think together, mate, we need to create a bit of content of an ideal calendar of communications and milestones, checkpoints that a genuine large-scale volunteer or workforce program needs to go through. So let's pencil that in, Matt.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think that your insight now would help a few people there. Now, again, probably a little granular for those listening. What does a classic journey look like for you in terms of the 3 months leading into? Let's use the Euros as an example. Like, when does your work start to really ramp up? Because you could go too early, right? And then people forget it by the time the event's happening. Like, what does a classic lead up to an event look like, timing wise, training, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, this is important, especially in an environment where you're delivering a large scale event or whatever it is. When do you start to engage from a training perspective with that volunteer? And I think what you said, Shannon, about, you don't want to go too early, right? Because they forget about it by the time you go operational, right? So it's really, typically it's the month before. So the month before you start.
Sure, okay. 1 month.
You start going at it pretty hard. And again, you want this to be top of mind because you're talking to them about, your experience standards or your volunteering standards, the expectations, the things that really make an experience happen or a visitor connection happen versus things that, detract from that experience. And you want them to remember that. So you have to kind of hit them within a time period that they're not going to forget it. And then once you get on the ground, which I think is another really, really important aspect to training and engagement with staff, volunteers, frontliners, is that you have to then refresh on what you were talking about, right? So in daily briefings with volunteers before you send them out, that you're saying, hey, remember we talked about hospitality as one of our experience standards, for instance. Remember, this is what it means, right? So today, when you're doing X, Y, and Z, this is how you can deliver hospitality. We make eye contact, we give a warm welcome, we try to anticipate their needs. Training doesn't just stop, when the event starts. You have to then kind of do refresher, and organizations that do customer service or visitor experience really well, they're reminding teammates, staff members, frontliners every single day about exactly what is a great experience. And so it should be the same thing in a volunteering environment where you're reminding them, hey, you remember we talked about safety, right? So safety is one of our whatever experience standards, quality standards. And safety today means that we're all going to be, looking out for trip hazards, or we're all going to be keeping an eye on, if we see any unattended backpacks or something, you know what I mean? So it's a constant opportunity to be getting them thinking and making sure that you're focused on exactly what's going to deliver that visitor experience.
Yeah, for sure. It's and again that balance between paid staff and volunteers. How do you go about, I guess, the re-education, or if a volunteer is perhaps not delivering to the level you need to, it's perhaps not as easy as a paid staff member to pull them aside and reset expectations, or is it still really important to do that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I do think it's really important to do that. Just because they're a volunteer doesn't mean that, they don't have a responsibility to deliver whatever role they accepted. And I think that's also why you see, even in paid roles, but also in volunteer roles, where people will self exit, right? They will self exit because whatever the role was, that's not what they expected. So they decide, you know what, I'm gonna self exit this position, which, if I'm to be honest with, that's what you want to happen. And even in, full-time organizations, you want people to self exit. If you're setting expectations, if you're saying this is what the role and responsibilities are, this is what we expect of you, then you want some people to self exit because they're not in it anyways, right? They don't have a connection to it. They don't see their purpose in that role. And so you do want them to self exit, because if they don't self exit and they stay in the role, guess what they do? They bring down other volunteers, right? So other volunteers now look at Jimmy or Sammy or Cindy, and they go, she's just standing over there and she's not doing anything, because again, Sammy or Cindy is not connected to whatever it is that the purpose is. And then it brings down the other volunteers, which means that now you have a group of volunteers that aren't connected, right? That aren't focused and able to deliver. So, I think my take on this is that you treat a volunteer just like you would treat, someone who's getting paid. You set expectations, you
Sure.
give them a purpose, and you give them an opportunity to self exit if they need to, because again, you don't want them staying in it and bringing the rest of the team down.
Yeah, it's a really interesting perspective on volunteer engagement. Yeah, thank you, mate. More granular question again, perhaps, and for our listeners around mandatory training, especially when it's online. Yes or no? Do you make it flexible because not everyone wants to log in and do something online, or do you make it mandatory because it's just showing the investment you're putting into them to say that if you can't bother doing this, then do we expect that you can do it come game time? What are your thoughts on
Shannon, I've got a strong opinion on this, and I'm sure you could
that?
expect that. Again, if you're
Yes.
setting expectations from the very beginning, right before, when someone volunteers, you say, this is what we expect. You're gonna have to go through 2 hours of online training. That's part of how we get you ready and prepared to be a successful, impactful volunteer. So you set expectations from the very beginning, and then yes, it's absolutely mandatory, because if one volunteer does the training and one doesn't do the training, now you've got volunteers at different levels of, accountability, expectations. So how then does a volunteer leader then manage those two volunteers? One went through the training, knows exactly, what was expected. The other one decided they weren't going to go through it, and now that volunteer leader is having to manage that on the ground, right? And so that doesn't make any sense from an operational perspective. So again, you don't throw something at a volunteer, be like, oh, now you got to do 14 hours of online training that we didn't tell you about. No, that's not the way to go about it. But to set expectations from the very beginning, and then they know what they're getting into. And then again, when you get there, if they don't do it, you can say, listen, this is a really important part of being part of our group, our team, this event, and we really need you to do this.
Yeah, yeah, fantastic, mate. Now, you've been very, very generous with your time away from your little Barcelona fishing village there, Matt. So we appreciate this. What about for our listeners? You've seen it all. I don't know if there's many people around the world that would have a greater insight than you in terms of this space. what would be your number one or two sort of tips of advice for engaging with volunteers in a succinct summary?
Again, I mean, I think, I talked about this at the very beginning. I think you have to know how your volunteer ticks, right? Why are they volunteering? So you have to know or think about what's in it for them. You have to think about, and I think we know a decent amount of data or information about why people volunteer. You have to be extremely people focused, right? If you're in volunteering, you're, in an organizing committee, you need people working on your team that are people focused, that understand people, because guess what? When you have 1,000, 10,000, 50,000 volunteers, you're going to have 50,000 different personalities, right? From different backgrounds. And so you have to have whoever's on your team, yourself included, you have to be people focused. If a volunteer comes up to you, you better be people focused, and you better give them the time of day, be respectful of them, be professional. That's really, really difficult. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges for volunteer coordinators is that you've got a lot of people, right, that want to do a great job, that are purpose driven, and they're going to ask a lot of questions because they want to make sure that they're doing their job right and they know all the information they need to know. And so, I think that would be my takeaway. I mean, I just worked the Euros in an operations, capacity, leading volunteers, working alongside volunteers. And that's what they want, right? They want to have connections. They want to be connected socially with people. They want to do a great job. They want to be able to attain all the information and knowledge they possibly can so they can do that, that role that you've given them. So I think being people focused is absolutely critical.
Yeah, awesome, mate. Thank you. Lovely. Well, look, mate, I think we might wrap it there. It's been a great 40-odd minutes we've spent together, getting an insight into the journey of Moonshot as an organisation, and then for volunteer managers around the world to listen to some of your insights about the best way to engage with those volunteers and get the best outcomes. I agree with everything you've said. So, mate, thanks so much for your time. And yeah, any last comments?
I think, from our perspective, we love working with volunteers. At the Euros, it kind of, brought me back to basics, being, on the ground with them. And I think that was really, really a great opportunity for all of us. And I appreciate you inviting me on, and I hope to catch up soon.
Yeah, good man. No worries. All right, mate. Thanks again.
See you later.
See you, mate. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Engage Volunteer Podcast with Matt Lynch, founder and director of MoonShot. I hope you've all taken away some key points of volunteer training and engagement from Matt's experience in some of the large volunteer and workforce programs in the world. We'll be announcing our next guests in a few weeks' time, so please keep an eye on our socials, and we look forward to catching you then.